Well, good morning, everybody. How we doing? How many of you are out of school now, or how many of your kids are out of school now? Yes, fantastic. Kids are excited, parents and guardians less so sometimes about summer. We'll see. But I'm so glad that you're here. Julie, thanks for leading us. You are a leader worth following. Phenomenal job. We are in the middle of a series called Staying Power. And for the last few weeks, we've been talking about what does it look like to build and cultivate resilience in our life, in our faith, in our story. And so before I dive into the teach today, just want to welcome you to our construction chic auditorium. For those of you watching online, like, what are you talking about? We don't have any carpet right now. But more than just acknowledging the concrete-colored elephant in the room, which elephants are gray. They are concrete-colored, so it works out. It's redundant. But other than that, I also just wanted to thank a couple people who came in twice this past week to clear our auditorium and then reset it. And so thank you all for being here. Thanks for serving. Kevin and Tom and Gail and Andrew and Josh, just thank you for being a part of what God is doing in the unseen ways. John and many others, just moving stuff. So this was set up for you walked in, but that was because, like Julie said, other people took steps to get involved. And when you step into finding a serving role, God uses you in ways. And so I just hope you would take that encouragement and find a spot on one of these teams coming up leading into the fall when school gets back in session and things kind of get more regular in people's lives. We tend to see an increase in what God is doing here and people coming, and we want to be ready for them. As Julie so eloquently said, God's doing his part. That's an incredible number of first-time guests that we've had in the last 12 months. And we want to be ready for them, whether this becomes their home or not, that they would just have a great experience here. And so I hope you can join one of those teams. All right, well, as we continue today talking about this idea of resilience, talking about how do we actually build from our brokenness, this thing that all of us have in our life that we often feel, especially in a place like church, we have to keep hidden or keep to the side or not mention, right? That we all bring actually all of our brokenness with us everywhere that we go. And often we can think that the best move is to try to hide from that brokenness. But actually what I hope becomes clear today is that when we face it, when we embrace it, and ultimately when we offer it to God to use, that God wants to actually build something beautiful from your brokenness, as Julie said. That God doesn't turn away from our brokenness. Perhaps you were raised, if you grew up in church, that you were taught a theology that your brokenness makes God look away. But actually, that's the opposite of what we see in the scriptures, is that God is actually drawn to our brokenness. God actually steps in and desires for us to trust him with those spaces of our life that we often feel that we must hide from others and ultimately from God. And so today, we're going to do something that's a little bit unique. We're going to do a flyover of a person in the scriptures. His name is David. You've heard much of his story, probably, at least the highlight reel. But we're going to not go to the highlight stories today. How many of you know that in your life, you also have highlight reel stories? Those are the things that you might post on Instagram or talk about at family get-togethers or holiday parties. But then there's the rest of your life. Right? No, just me. I'm the only one that does that. That's just me, right? You have the rest of your life, your real life, right? The parts where you don't know how it's going to work out, or you feel frustrated with yourself or with God or with your circumstances. And that is where we're going to go today in David's life. I remember when Katie and I were first student pastors, and we were at a church, and we were honestly, just to be totally upfront, we were struggling under the leadership that we were under. We were just having a really, really tough time. We could not seem to vibe. We could not seem to kind of get around this struggle we were having because they were doing things very differently than we would have. And we found ourselves more and more getting frustrated with the style of leadership and just feeling like this isn't a fit for us. We got to go. We got to leave. And within 6 months of taking that job, we were looking for another job. And then 2 years into that job, because we just couldn't get hired anywhere, I guess. No, that's not true. But, we never felt like it was right to leave. But 2 years later, we're having lunch with another member of that staff team. He kind of could tell we were going through some stuff, and he invited us to lunch. And he asked how we were doing and whether it was through being young and naive, or whether it was a Holy Spirit like moment of vulnerability, we were honest with him and shared our frustration and how we felt undervalued and suppressed, and how just by no intentional step of our own, but what had happened is we were kind of building a church within a church, and we were gathering people that loved what we were doing in our student ministry, and gathering those families, and they were there because we were there, and that was the only reason they were staying, and it totally inflated our ego. And we're having lunch with this guy, and he took the courageous move to share something with us, and I'll never forget this because it certainly wasn't what I wanted to hear. You have those moments where, like, if someone tells you what you expect and what you want to hear, you forget those conversations. But when someone takes a risk to give you a gift of what you actually need to hear that you didn't go searching for, those can potentially be dramatic turning point moments in your life. And this certainly was one for us. And I'll never forget, what he said was, I believe that God has something bigger for you both than this. But until he reveals and releases you to that, can I give you some encouragement? He said, I would encourage you to commit to being honest but submissive and stay here as long as you can until God lets you leave or leads you somewhere else. And actually, you will learn something by being supportive of a leadership you don't trust that you would never learn elsewhere. And he challenged us, and he asked this question. This is an important question of, can a person that I don't like teach me something that I don't know? Can a person that you don't like teach you something that you don't know? Our culture right now says absolutely not, right? Absolutely not. You disagree with anyone about any little thing, canceled. Change the channel, go to the other side, whatever, right? But this was the question that he stirred in our soul. And it has been a profound question for me for years. And he offered us a book. It's a very short book, but it's not one that you read through quickly because it's one of those books that reads you know what I mean? And the book is called A Tale of Three Kings by Gene Edwards. And it's perhaps one of the most powerful little books in our leadership journey. It's gloriously subtitled A Study in Brokenness, which makes it an immediate bestseller, right? Everybody wants to grab a book called, A Study in Brokenness. I can't wait, right? But it follows the story of King Saul, King David, and King Absalom, who are in lineage with one another. And this book is one that we've recommended to many, many people, but it challenges us, and it drives us, and it draws out of us, honestly, the question of what do we do with the brokenness that we all carry, whether that's leadership brokenness, family of origin brokenness, brokenness in how we view ourselves, our relationships, our partner, how we view God, right? How we view what we're supposed to do in this world, how we're supposed to go about our job or our life or finances. And it brings this idea of brokenness to the surface. And so as we start talking about brokenness, we all might have different thoughts. And so I thought it'd be helpful to clarify some terms. And so Cambridge Dictionary, great place to go searching for answers, right, defines brokenness this way: a condition in which something is damaged and unable to continue or work correctly, or a state of strong emotional pain that stops someone from living a normal or healthy life. You're like, same, right? Got it. Yes, like I am not working correctly right now. I'm struggling. And whether you've had a moment of that, a space in your life that kind of defines that definition, whether it's been a season of your life, or whether it's an area that you just have yet to really face, because if you're honest, you're too afraid to dive into that corner of your world for fear of what you might find there or what might God ask of you if you explore that. We all have spaces in our life where we're facing that kind of emotional pain that stops us from living a normal or healthy life. We carry around broken pieces of ourselves every day. And so as we do this flyover today, the unique stories in King David's life, again, he was perhaps the most notorious figure in the Hebrew Scriptures, right? The first 2/3 of your Bible. He's the most famous king in the nation of Israel. This is the same David who was the giant killer, the one who was a shepherd boy and killed a 9-foot-tall giant with a slingshot. That's the same David, right? But just in case you didn't know, the story of David's life and reign and ultimate demise comes from 4 different books in the Old Testament. And also, many of the Psalms that were written for people to worship in ancient Israel are written by David, really giving us the behind-the-scenes director's cut of what he's feeling and what he is personally experiencing through the history of his life and the stories that we're going to look at today. Right? So we feel what David is feeling through many adventures, struggles, successes, and even wilderness seasons as we go through the Psalms. And so the question I hope comes to mind for us today is that how do you and I make decisions when it comes to our own brokenness? If we all have it, and at some level we all have to do something with it, even if that choice is to just push it down and ignore it, is there a way to actually make wise and healthy decisions even when it feels like everything in life is against you? Like, what do you do when there's a gap between your expectations of something and your experience? I thought getting married was going to be like this. I thought this new job was going to be like this. I thought following God and going to church and loving and following Jesus was going to be like this, but it's like this, and there's a gap. When there's a stark difference between what you believe God's called you to and what you're currently experiencing in this present circumstance, what do we do with our brokenness when we thought we were someone and then our actions prove that there's something else going on beneath the surface? So if you have a Bible, we're going to do a lot of page turning, so I hope you're ready, all right? So everybody go like this. Warm up your fingers. Warm up your fingers. If you have a Bible, turn to 1 Samuel 18. If you didn't bring your own, that's okay. There's one in the seat back pocket directly in front of you. I would encourage you to grab it. In this Bible, it's on page 174. That'll fast track you there. I'd love for all of us to turn there so we can go through this together, because this is an important series of stories that we're going to look at this morning. And we say this all the time, but if you don't have a copy of the scriptures that you can read and understand, I would highly encourage you. Steal a Bible from church today. We couldn't get carpet for you, but we got a Bible for you. So steal it from church. We love having to replace them because it means that as complicated as this book is, that there's a copy of the scriptures in your hands that you can hopefully read and understand and find life and hope in God through. So starting in verse 6 of 1 Samuel 18, we pick up with the story of David. He has already killed Goliath, and he goes off and fights with the army of Israel to come back home and have a lot of success. And so it says this: when the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel come out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals, and this was their song: Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. I think in Hebrew it actually rhymes, and so it has a little bit more of a beat to it than it does in English, right? It's kind of weak, but this was a banger, all right, in first century. So here's the thing, right? In ancient Israel, the king it's a theocracy. So not only is the king the leader of the army and the leader of the political system, but is also the connector to God, right? And so David has already been crowned the next king. He's been anointed by the prophet to become the next king, but that was years ago. Years ago. He had to stay in the field, being a shepherd with his parents, right? He eventually gets called to deliver food to his brothers who were in the army, right? So he's an Uber Eats driver, right? And eventually he gets called up to be the one to go against Goliath. And now as a young man, he's fighting in the army and is gaining all kinds of notoriety. So this is the peak of David's kind of fame before he actually takes any political authority at all. And so Saul was stoked to have David in his army. Wouldn't you be? You hear a song like that? Saul's awesome. David is 10 times as awesome. As you come home, everybody's cheering like that. They couldn't leave that part out for you, right? Let Saul have his moment. And so this made Saul very angry because that's what happens, right, when you get showed up, right? What is this, he says? They credit David with 10,000, but me only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king. So from that point on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Have you ever had that happen in your life? Someone takes credit for a project at work, right? Someone pushes their boundary line a little bit close to you and lets their hedges overgrow, right? Someone else's kid gets the spot on the team that you thought your kid actually deserved, let's be honest, right? And you just feel that tendency show up in your life. He's got a jealous eye towards this person. This is what Saul is feeling. And it says, the very next day, a tormenting spirit overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. David was playing the harp as he did each day. So not only does he kill it on the battlefield, but he's a musician and a poet too. I'm just saying, it's just sometimes it's not fair, right? Some of you know what this is like. It's just not fair. You have too much talent. I feel like that about Mr. Michael, right? It's what I tell my kids. It's like he's awesome and he can sing. Yeah, it's not fair, right? So a tormenting spirit comes over Saul, and David's there just playing his harp, trying to calm him down, right? And Saul had a spear in his hand, and he suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped him twice. Now, the writer says twice. We find out through the other writings of David's life that this was actually the first of 11 attempts that Saul makes to kill David. Like David could not take a hint, apparently, right? And here's what's crazy, is David goes very quickly following this story from national hero to Israel's most wanted for no fault of his own, for doing a great job, actually. Like, this is absolutely unfair. This wasn't like, oh, I didn't get my way, so I felt hurt or I didn't feel safe. David's life was actually in danger. Literally, he was being hurled a spear at by the king, who was a great warrior. And yet, for some reason, David is able to get out of the way when he needs to, but his heart stays soft to continue to allow him to serve someone that even he doesn't believe in, he doesn't trust, and actually let God be in charge of the outcome. It's one of those moments where you look at David's life, you're like, how does he do it? Flip over to 1 Samuel 24, a couple pages over on page 177 if you're in the Blue Bible. And this is a moment where David's been on the run for a while. He's hiding out in caves in the wilderness, and Saul gets so upset he starts following David with thousands of men, right? Thousands of people from his army to hunt down one person who's on the run. This fugitive clearly was problematic for Saul. And it says this, at the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into the cave to relieve himself, right? So this is in the Bible, right? You're welcome, right? But there's this moment where if you're a soldier and you have to use the restroom, you just kind of go and catch up. If the king has to go, everybody stops, right? So he goes into the cave to relieve himself. And as it happened, I love the author's like tongue-in-cheek here. As it happened, David and his men were hiding further back in that very cave. Like, what are the odds, okay? Now is your opportunity. David's men whispered to him. They obviously could read the signs, right? Today the Lord is giving you this guy, right? He says, he told you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do with him as you wish. So David creeps forward in the dark, and he gets to where Saul is and decides to cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe, which was a capital offense in ancient Israel. But then don't miss this, then David's conscience began bothering him, because he had cut Saul's robe. Something happened in that moment where something in David's heart and mind says, wait, what I'm about to do isn't right. What I'm about to do this isn't the right way. It could have been really a beautiful story, right? The king goes into the cave to go to the bathroom. He has his robe, he has his crown, he has his sword. And then out of that very cave a few moments later, because they didn't have iPads, so it was only a few moments. It wasn't like 45 minutes, right? You're welcome. Out of that cave comes David with robe and crown and sword. Like, that is picturesque. Like, J.R.R. Tolkien couldn't have written a better story than that, right? Like, that could have been a great story from David's perspective. But his conscience strikes him. And he says to his men, the Lord forbid it that I should do this to my Lord the king. They're like, Lord, you're king. This guy's hunting you down. Right? I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed, says David, for the Lord himself has chosen him. So David goes back and restrains his men, and does not let them kill Saul. Like, this is a big decision moment, right? Because David has two options, right? He knows two things are simultaneously true. He knows that he has been promised that one day he will be the king. He also knows at the same time he was not to harm the king, but was actually to humbly submit to the Lord. And in this moment, those two simultaneous realities come crashing together, because while this seemed easier for David to take power by force, something I believe whispered to his soul is that how you get power is how you lead with that power. And so he knows that if he were to gain the kingship by killing the king, he would always be leading with an eye over his shoulder. And I think the same is true for us, right? That he was going to go for the right thing, but do the right thing the wrong way if he were to kill Saul and take power himself. And instead, he says, you know what? If God has anointed me to be king, I will trust God and let him elevate me in the right time rather than try to predict and create the outcome for myself. I mean, isn't that challenging? I mean, there are so many spaces in my life where, if I'm honest, I am tempted to want to create what I think is the best outcome rather than leave the outcome up to God. That David, in this moment, chooses to obey even though it costs him something. And it makes me ask the question, maybe it makes you ask the question, where am I trying to work around something in my life rather than let God work it out for me? Perhaps there's something I'm trying to get out of that perhaps God has put in my life for a reason. Where am I looking for God to give me a personal exception to what he has perhaps already said? I remember we were leading a church in Chicago, and there was a girl on one of my teams. We did a huge Christmas event for one of the schools in our neighboring neighborhood that was dramatically overlooked and under-resourced by the district. And so we created this great event, and she was leading the team, and we had one of our team meetings that I couldn't be at, and it apparently didn't really go that well. It was disorganized, and it just wasn't up to standard from what she wanted or what we wanted as a church, and it kind of represented a little bit of lack of engagement and a lack of enthusiasm for this event that we were actually really excited about. And unfortunately, it was the first event that parents and leaders and teachers from this school were actually present to give their input, and they were just a little bit chaotic. And Anne, who was leading this team, unbeknownst to me, took it upon herself to actually send an email apologizing for that meeting being a little bit in disarray, not just to me as her leader, but to every team lead that was there and every person from the school that showed up. That night, before they even got home from that meeting, there was an email waiting for them from her apologizing for how the meeting was run and inviting them back to the next one, promising that it would be better. And as I saw that email that I was BCC'd on, it was one of those moments where I'm like, what happened in her heart to say, I got to do this? Now, Anne was an incredible leader. She worked for an incredible organization. She's a professional at every level. And yet in this moment, she decided to take a risk and say, hey, I didn't do this right. It's on me. As a leader of this event, I'm going to take responsibility for this. And in that moment, when she admits that kind of failure, right, my trust for her went up. My trust for her as a leader grew because she was able to say, hey, this wasn't what we meant. It happened. It was on me. Give us another chance. And in those moments, it's this question that David is wrestling with in this same passage is, do I just get past it and hope nobody noticed? Or do I actually say, hey, God is going to use this moment to actually bring something beautiful even out of this brokenness? And so Saul leaves the cave, and David comes out to the mouth of the cave, holds up the corner of the robe, and apologizes to Saul and says, look, I could have, but I didn't, because you're still the one that God has put in authority over me. You're still the one that God has called me to submit to. And while, yes, I have been anointed to be the next king, I want to serve you as long as God has you in that spot. This is this powerful, challenging moment in the life of David. And the question for us is, why was he able to do that? Why was he able to have that kind of experience when something so visceral and something so dangerous was literally hunting him down? See, for all that we can tell, David spent about 8 years of his life running from cave to cave in the wilderness, trying to evade Saul. And while we know from the privilege of history that time was called his pre-king years, he just lived it like a Monday. Like, isn't it interesting that we can read that and go, wow, what a brave guy. But then in our own life on Monday or Tuesday when things go well, we're like, I can't get through this. And I think this is what is so powerful about the scriptures. They don't just tell us about who God is, but it shows us what is possible for us. And I know for many of you are walking through seasons right now, spaces right now, struggles right now that feel like you're pre-king years. You're running from cave to cave with your health or with your finances or with your relationships, with your faith, with your future. You don't know what God has for you, and things aren't turning out the way that you thought. And you can probably resonate with David as you read through some of the poems and songs that he wrote that are recorded for us in the Psalms about this season of his life, where he's like, God, where are you? What did I do wrong? I supported the king. I played the harp, right? I got a spear thrown at me. I evaded that. Thank you very much. I mean, I killed Goliath. I won battles for this guy. It's not my fault that King Saul went mad. Why am I the one on the run for my life? Like, God, where are you? Like, I didn't take Saul's life when I could have, and yet I'm still having to flee because he's still hunting me. Like, have you ever had those kind of moments in your life where you just can't seem to catch a break, and you wonder, where is God? Are you still there? Are you still for me? Do you still even care? Are you listening? I think we've all felt powerless in one relationship or environment or another where we try to compensate for feeling a lack of power in one relationship by trying to have power in another one. When you feel like it's rough at home, you're tough on your kids. Or you feel like it's difficult at work, and then you bring it home, and you're tough at home. Whether it's in one relationship or another, whether it's one space or another. I can't win in my health, but I'm going to kill it in my finances, or vice versa. Right? I'm going to go get a great job and get a bunch of money, but your mental health or your physical health deteriorates, and your body fails you. Like, we all have this tension where we feel like we just can't have it both ways, and our brokenness gets the best of us. And I think that God was actually teaching David something in the caves that he would need when he eventually got the crown. And I think the same is true for you. I think the same is true for you in your cave season right now. That rather than resist it or try to escape it or try to get out of the very thing that you might be in right now, as painful as it might be, what if there was something that God had in store for you, hidden in the back of that cave season, that you're going to need in the future, that you're going to need in the next season of your life when the pain might subside? Because I can tell you it's absolutely true that what we learned the last 2 years of our first job, after we had read this book, had lunch with that guy, and God began to shift and mold and change our perspective about brokenness, I learned more about myself in those 2 years that set me up for the next job I had. I learned things in that season that I still to this day use in this job. That I'm a better leader, a better husband, a better father, a better pastor because I decided to stay. And before you think, wow, this is a great victory lap, Kurt, thank you so much. I'm not saying it for myself. I'm not saying it because I'm great. I'm saying it because it was hard. It was difficult. But I had to face my own brokenness because as we read through that book, Tale of Three Kings, David clearly saw that Saul wasn't his enemy. But there was something in Saul that also reflected something that was in him. And while they both had the same challenge, Saul chose to avoid it. David chose to face it. So we continue in the story in 2 Samuel 15. If you flip over to page 190. And now David is king. Saul has died. And David's oldest stepson, Absalom, is starting to brew his own rebellion against David. And a messenger shows up and arrives in Jerusalem, the capital city, and says to David, all of Israel, hyperbole, but all of Israel has joined Absalom in a conspiracy against you. There's about to be an insurrection. David says, then we must flee at once, or it will be too late. He urges his men, hurry, don't miss this language, this is powerful. If we get out of the city before Absalom arrives, both we and the city of Jerusalem will be spared from disaster. See, when we do not embrace our own brokenness, it's so easy to result in blame shifting as our only option. Like that is our only resort, is when I don't take responsibility for my own brokenness, I have to blame others. And so because David had faced and embraced his own brokenness, that even as king, rather than standing up for what he felt was his to own, even against his stepson, he allowed himself to go on the run again as an old man so that the people of Jerusalem would be safe. He understood that being king was not for his own glory, and it was not for him to decide, but he was there serving at the pleasure of God for the people of Jerusalem. And so his best step, his wisest decision, was actually to even flee from his own son. But that's really hard to do, isn't it? It's really hard to have that level of open-handedness about the thing that you have come to love, the thing that you've come to even feel connected to, or even, if you're really honest, feel that you deserve, feel that you're entitled to. And David says something so profound. It says, we must leave so that the city of Jerusalem will be spared from disaster. He says, this fight is not between me and Absalom. It's actually something that God is doing, and it's not worth letting everyone else suffer for my pride. David takes radical responsibility, and in effect, his choices that he knows affect other people, he's able to make better choices. Rather than to self-protect, he decides to not be selfish and not let others be harmed because of his decision. So he goes on the run. Again, he knows that he has the choice to stay and fight, but that will harm others, and so instead he chooses to serve those that he's been entrusted to lead. Because he embraced his past brokenness, stories that maybe you well know, right, where he made massive mistakes. He knew that he was not a perfect leader. It enabled him, because he faced it, to make better decisions in the future. So on the run, this part's so funny. This feels like a Game of Thrones episode, right? David is leading with a few men, right? And he comes to the village of Bahurim. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 16. Comes to the village of Bahurim, and a man comes out from the village cursing them. It was Shimei, son of Gera, doesn't matter, right? From some clan of Saul's family, right? He throws stones at the king. Remember, David is still king of Israel at this point, right? Throws stones at the king and the king's officers and all the mighty warriors who surrounded him. Get out of here, you murderer, you scoundrel, this guy yells at David. The Lord is paying you back for all the bloodshed in Saul's clan. You stole his throne, and now the Lord has given it to your son Absalom. At least you will taste some of your own medicine, for you are a murderer. I mean, he's not holding back, right? He is putting David on blast. And you have maybe had, I know I have, moments like this where people are hurling insults at you, things that are not true, right? They're telling you out loud their own story about you. And I wish in those moments I could respond the way David does. But before he does, some of his men say the quiet part out loud, right? That why should this dead dog curse the Lord my king, Abishai, son of Zeruiah, demanded, right? And he was one of the military warriors with David. Let me go over there and cut off his head, right? Well, easy, like just solve this problem. It'll be quick. No, the king said. Who asked your opinion, you son of Zeruiah, right? If the Lord has told him to curse me, who are you to stop him? See, David, throughout his life, seems to display this perspective on circumstances that God is at work even in the things that he didn't like. That even in the things that he didn't like, even the people he didn't like, even when he felt at danger, there was something that God might have for him, even in those moments that were difficult. So David said to Abishai and to all his servants, my own son is trying to kill me. Like, don't you get it? Like, this guy's nothing. My own son is coming after me. Doesn't this relative of Saul have even more reason to do so? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to do it. And perhaps, this is so powerful, perhaps the Lord will see that I am being wronged and will bless me because of these curses today. In Hebrew, what David basically says is, hey, let it happen, because if it's true, then I deserve it. And if it's not, God will vindicate me. Let it happen, because if it's true, then I deserve it and I have something to learn. And if not, the Lord will be the one that vindicates me. I don't have to take control of this. I don't have to take this into my own hands. What a powerful perspective for you and I to have on the areas of our life, the circumstances of our life where we feel broken. So David and his men continued down the road, and the Shimei kept pace with them on a nearby hillside, cursing and throwing stones and dirt at David the whole way, right? So it's not like, oh, that's such a nice sentiment. You trust God, and then the guy immediately falls over dead or quiets down, or at least gets tired and goes back home for a snack. No, he followed them the whole way, throwing insults and throwing stones, right? This is so incredible to me because David never gives up on what God wants to teach him. See, how do you build something beautiful? How do you let God build something beautiful in your life, even through your brokenness? Is that you decide that you're never going to give up on what God might want to teach you. You just decide you've never arrived. You've never learned enough that now it's over. You always determine that there is something that God might want to do, even in circumstances that you would like to avoid. Turn over to page 193. We're wrapping this story up where Absalom comes after David. Again, this is the king's stepson trying to usurp his authority and take the throne. It says this in verse 5 of 2 Samuel 18. Absalom and the Israelites' army had set up camp in the land of Gilead, and the king gave this command to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. These are his three generals. It says, for my sake, deal gently with young Absalom. And all the troops heard the king give this order to his commanders. Even at an old age, when David's had to flee Jerusalem, flee his throne, he's getting cursed by who knows what out in the wilderness. He tells his generals, hey, be as gentle as you can. I know there's going to be a battle. I know there's going to be a fight. Don't hold this against my son. And I read that passage, and I'm just so deeply moved that this is the man after God's own heart that we hear about in the story of David. That while he was flawed and had incredible patterns that he had to overcome that were damaging and destructive, even at the end of his life, David is willing to extend forgiveness to someone who has wronged him yet again. How? How can he do that? And it is because when we embrace our own brokenness, we become less brittle. That when you and I, like David did, embrace our brokenness, that we don't have it all figured out, that we've caused damage, that you have brokenness of your own that you carry around, and there is brokenness that you and I have each caused in other people's lives. When we just embrace that, recognize who we really are, we become far less brittle. We break and crack and get back at people far less easily when we recognize that we too have brokenness in our life and in our story. See, there's a pattern in David's life that I think is powerful for you and I when it comes to the areas of our life that we have brokenness, some that we recognize and some that we may not, right? Is that David always served the call of God in his current assignment, right? In fact, in Proverbs, it says that David followed the purpose of God in his generation. He basically lived his life with two marching orders. Do the last thing that God told you to do and stay connected to the Spirit. Do the last thing God told you to do, keep doing it, and stay with his presence. That David was faithful in the small things so consistently that he eventually would be entrusted with bigger and better things. He was faithful in private so that he could actually handle it when the pressure was on in public. I remember having coffee with a college group leader of mine. We were at UC Santa Barbara. We were up in Isla Vista, and we were having Starbucks in the morning because I didn't know any better, and that's all we had. But we were having coffee, and he told me this story. This leader's name was Billy, and he told me this story. And he said, you know, every opportunity David ever had was wrapped in obedience. And he wouldn't have gained the next opportunity if he didn't obey the last order, the last invitation. And he says, your opportunities, Kurt, in your life, right now and in the future, but every moment, exactly where you are, every opportunity you're going to have is going to be wrapped up in your own obedience. And he tells me this story, and he points me to this prelude, this 2 verses before David is ever promoted to anything, where he's offered the armor of the king when he goes to fight Goliath. And he says, no, I'm not actually going to do it your way, because when I was a shepherd, there was a lion that came to attack the sheep, and because God was with me, I took it out. And then there was a wolf, and then there was a bear, and every time the Lord was with me, and I protected the sheep, and I took out the bear, I took out the wolf. And God said, do the same thing now. And it was that moment where he was telling me the story, and I thought, that's actually really curious, because David had small experiences where he learned to trust God even when things were coming at him, even when things were not going his way, even when things were in between him and his desired outcome. And he always chose to protect whatever he was put in charge of. And then we see the same thing happen over and over and over again with Saul, with Jerusalem, and even with his own son who's trying to kill him. Because David had developed this pattern of doing what God had said he was going to do, and opportunities were wrapped in obedience. And he challenged me. He says, I think God's going to have some opportunities for you in your life, and I want you to practice staying in his presence and practice obedience. And one of the things he challenged me to do, which was a lot at the time because I was in college and I thought I had a lot better things to do, but he said, I want you to spend each day of the week reading Ephesians, Philippians, Galatians, Colossians, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. One book each day, all 5 days for the remainder of this month. Not because you need to learn more, and not because God loves you more if you do, but to prove to yourself that you can discipline yourself for big things. That's what he said. And in that process, reading it every week for a month, I got to this point where I came to love this one passage in Colossians that speaks to what does it look like to allow God to build on our brokenness in community, right? And in Colossians 3, 12 and 15, it says this, and this is where we're going to close. It says, since God chose you to be the holy people that he loved, right? That's God's part. What's our part? You must clothe yourself with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. As we talked about in the first week of this series, you don't force those things to be. You stay connected to the presence of God, and those things begin to grow. But those things only grow when you recognize, hey, I have brokenness that I bring to this equation. He says, make allowances for each other's faults. Forgive anyone who offends you. Be like David. Remember that the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. And above all, the Apostle Paul writes, clothe yourself with love that binds us all together in perfect harmony. Not uniformity, but harmony. And let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body, you are called to live in peace. What the Apostle Paul, a man who was very familiar with his own brokenness, would tell the church in Colossae, those people trying to follow Jesus in the first century, and I believe what God is trying to tell you and me today here at Restoration Church, is that when we live in community that's open about our brokenness, that God actually wants to build something beautiful with it. That openness about when we fall actually can lift others up. That openness about what you're struggling with actually can give other people hope. That openness about what you're going through, that you don't have to hold it to yourself. You can actually share what you've been through, and that can give other people strength that might be in the same battle or going into a similar one in the future. Because if we want God to fulfill the promises that he's put on your life, because I believe that's what you want. Remember, God wants you to grow more than you know, right? That for us to experience all that he has for us, we are going to have to trust him for his will, his way, and in his timing. This is what David understood, right? That while it may not be easy, it certainly won't be comfortable, it will be worth it. It might not be what you expect, and it might even be what you want in the moment. But great callings are never easy and never comfortable. But we are invited, encouraged to actually bring the full magazine of our emotions, of our challenges, of our brokenness to God. And when we do, we will find that not only can he handle it, right? But there is something that he wants to do with it that is far more beautiful than we could have planned if we tried to fix it on our own. So my invitation for you this morning is, what does it look like for you to begin to trust like David and to trust God with an area of your life that might feel broken right now? It might be your relationship, it might be your finances, it might be your faith, right? It might be something that you've kept hidden from yourself or your partner or anybody that you love that happened a long time ago. And one of the things that I can promise you, because I know that some of you in here have a very difficult story, and in no way am I trying to minimize the brokenness that you might carry even into this room this morning. But what I do know is that what we see through the story of David, what we see through the narrative and the long arc of his life, is not that David was great. That's easy to stop there. But we get to see what happens when someone trusts God with the fullness of their story. And we recognize that the character of God shines through the life of David even more than David's accomplishments, and that there is actually nothing too broken for God to restore. That there were moments in the cave, there were moments in the palace where David thought it was over. David thought, surely this is too far. And while those things had real consequences, the arc of his life and what David is remembered for and what God did through his life is to build something beautiful with the brokenness that David offered him. And I believe the same is true for you. And so in just a moment, I'm going to pray and we're going to sing. And one of the things that maybe you've heard of when it comes to church spaces is this idea of confession, right? And if you grew up Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, right, there's a moment where you have to confess your sins to a priest, right, or to someone that, can go to God for you, right, so you don't mess it up, right? But that's kind of this idea, and it can feel really religious and like a hoop you have to jump through. But ultimately, all confession is agreeing with God about what is true. What confession ultimately is agreeing with God about what is real, about me, about my circumstance, about what I'm feeling. And I just want to lead you in just a moment to actually practice and do it now so that maybe you can do it later this week on your own, a regular practice of confession, of just admitting to God what might be broken in spaces in your life. Whether it's something that you've done or something that's been done to you, to just simply admit before God, hey, this is real. And God, I want you to build something beautiful even out of this. So I'd invite you to just close your eyes. We take a posture of prayer in here where we open our hands to God. We don't have to fold them. I mean, if it's going to help you focus, that's fine. But I think it's a beautiful posture to put our bodies in the way that we want our souls to feel, that we would open our hands to God and say, hey, you already see it. It's actually me that needs to show up and come to the table confessing what is real. So I just invite you, if you feel comfortable, to open up your hands, to take a deep breath and just take a moment to draw your attention to an area of your life that might feel broken. For some of us, that won't take any work at all. We're thinking about it constantly. And for others of us, it might actually take a minute. Where have I noticed a gap between who I want to be and who I actually am? And I would just invite you to hold that in your head and in your heart before God, and to notice what you might feel. And I just want to speak that if you feel shame, that's actually not how God feels. That God is drawn to your vulnerability. God is drawn to your honesty. God is drawn to your brokenness because he's the only one that can restore. And while there are people and voices and circumstances in our life that said this is something we can't talk about, God says, I actually already know and have loved you the whole time anyways. So God, I just pray that your Holy Spirit, that your presence would be felt in those spaces, especially for friends in this room and watching online that feel like there's something that they can't bring to you. Something that's too bad or too devastating or too painful. And yeah, I'm so grateful for the story of David in the Hebrew Scriptures, because the things we might say are too big, the really bad sins, he had them all. And yet it's described as a man after your own heart, not because his performance was perfect, but because his heart was open to you. He brought his brokenness freely. So God, may we be those kinds of people. May we confess and agree with you about what is ultimately true, and watch you do something that perhaps we could never imagine as you build something beautiful with our broken pieces. So God, we thank you. Pray it's in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.